the centralization of the EU, the political union of the EU, is deeply un-European and against the traditions and patrimony of our continent. We have contracted out our climate change policy to cultists who have lost any interest in empirical data or in the realm of what is possible. If you're a patriotic Romanian listening to this broadcast, resist the pressure to emigrate and don't be scared of going into politics.
Bună ziua! Urmăriți un podcast 1776. Acesta este primul episod al ediției în limba engleză a emisiunii noastre We the People. Pentru a sărbători această ocazie, sunt încântat să îl am alături de mine pe distinsul nostru invitat, Daniel Hannan. Membru al Partidului Conservator, Daniel Hannan a fost și membru al Parlamentului European pentru sud-estul Angliei din 1999 până în 2020. În prezent, Daniel Hannan este membru în exercițiu al Camerei Lorzilor. Daniel, hello, and thank you for coming to our very little corner of the internet. Very glad to have you on.
Such a pleasure to see you, by the way, Andrei. I've enjoyed all our conversations, and as I think I've told you, I have a thing about Romania, having been there at the two formative events in 1990, the storming of the police station and then the counter protest by the miners. I watched one of them through the windows of Hanul Manuk, which was the only place you could get beer in Bucharest in those days. So I've always been very, very interested and involved in the affairs of that country.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about that, especially for the people here in Romania. You told me that you have a history with Romania, and I wanted to maybe expand on that a little bit, to tell us a little bit for our audience what your experience, what your Romanian experience was like.
Well, I was very lucky in the timing of my birth because I had just left school when the Berlin Wall came down. And so I had this amazing opportunity before I went to university, when I had no ties, no mortgage, no family, to be able to travel and see at firsthand what was happening in what in those days we still called Eastern Europe. So this was the first half the very end of 1989 and then the first half of 1990. In most places, the free elections had been scheduled but not yet held. But the one place where I got to see the revolution was Romania itself. And I mean, I can remember, as maybe your older viewers will remember, just the unbelievable misery and deprivation under Ceausescu. The only things you could buy in Bucharest at that time were plum jam and what they called Italian vermouth. And even crossing from Romania into Hungary was like North Korea into South Korea in those days. So the transformation, and I really do want to stress this. It's human nature to complain about all the bad things and the survival of some of the old elites and all the rest of it. But I tell you, if any of us had to go back and live 3 days at the beginning of 1990, we would realize how lucky we are.
Right. It's funny you should mention that, because I remember about 15 years ago, maybe it was 2008 or something, I actually went to Hungary with a friend of mine, and it was his first time outside the country, outside of Romania. And even back then, as you crossed into Hungary, there were still differences, especially in the rural areas. So it's that difference lingered on for years after the revolution. So it's something to remember indeed.
Well, I think it was partly just the extent to which Ceausescu had created a hermit state and a personal autocracy, which was very different from what they called the goulash communism in Hungary in the 80s, where they had Austrian and German investment. Right. They had people going on scholarships to Western universities. I mean, it was a completely different civilizational model. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is that the constant argument you get in the West, and maybe you'll start getting it now in Romania, that real socialism has never been tried. Right? We can't judge socialism by the regimes that called themselves socialist. Well, okay, maybe. It's true that East Germany was not a perfect communist state. West Germany was not a perfect capitalist state, right? There were subsidies and distortions. But most people on our side of the argument are prepared to accept that, for good or ill, West Germany was more capitalist, right?
Right.
And it should be judged, with all its warts that way. Whereas communists somehow, socialists generally, somehow get this unique pass from any comparison to the real world implementation of their policies, right?
Right.
It's the only doctrine in the world where you're not allowed to infer anything from where it's been tried, whether in Venezuela or Cuba or whatever. Ceausescu's Romania was more communist than Jonas Kadar's, right? And you could see the difference.
Right. So, the reason I brought you on, and I told you this before, is that we're now looking at 4 more years of a Trump administration. And for us as conservatives, and indeed for everyone, I think it's important to see how we could best leverage as countries and as citizens this new Trump administration, because we do know that generally whatever happens in the States does not stay in the States, and even it somehow whatever happens there transfers to other countries. So America continues to be, for better or worse, continues to be the leader of the free world, so to speak. So before we actually start to get into that, there has been a lot of talk about the establishment generally, and that can mean a lot of things for a lot of people. How would you describe what we currently call the establishment, whether we talk about the US, the UK, the European Union, and indeed about the world in general? What would you say are the component forces and ideologies in this establishment?
Well, I mean, I suppose you would define the establishment as people who have power and are networked to each other without even being fully conscious of what they're doing. So historically, in my country, the establishment would have been, the pillars of the great institutions,
Right.
the bishops, the aristocracy, the chairman of the big banks, the chairman of the BBC, the ministers. Now, I would say that by that same definition, the establishment is radical lawyers, DEI consultants, race agitators, radical filmmakers. Again, the people who still have all these positions of privileged opinion, except that today's establishment is still convinced that they are very unconventional revolutionary people.
Right.
And they still talk about, they still see themselves as anti-establishment figures without realizing that they have become the establishment. But let's talk about Trump, because I think this is really interesting, right?
Right.
I mean, the bad thing about Trump for the rest of the world is the obvious one. And, well, actually, I say it's obvious. I'm not sure we've spent as much attention on this as it deserves. Trump's tariff policies could cause a global depression.
Right.
And I say this not just in theory, but we have empirical evidence, right? In 1930, in response to the Wall Street crash and to a downturn that was probably about to come to an end, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff reform. They applied tariffs to 20,000 imported products. US trade fell by 2/3. A number of other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, notably Canada. Americans had a lot less to spend because prices went up because of the tariffs. And therefore, the economy as a whole cramped up. And unlike in Britain, where we cut spending and pursued free trade and had actually very strong growth in the 30s, the US condemned itself to 7 years of recession. So the tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, they were not the only thing, but they were a big part of what turned the Wall Street crash into the Great Depression. And I think we have been surprisingly slow worldwide to focus on the danger that Trump might have exactly that effect. The levels of tariffs he's talking about are much higher even than in the Smoot-Hawley reforms. Now, his apologists will say, oh, no, but these tariffs are never actually going to come in. They'll never be enforced. It's all a negotiating ploy. First of all, I'm not sure that's true. the thing he has just announced as we have this conversation, that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China, they're not about trade. They're not commercial or economic in their inspiration. They're about immigration and drugs. In other words, he is expecting foreign countries to solve a domestic US problem, and he's threatening them if they don't solve it. Except, of course, he's not threatening them. I mean, he is incidentally, but he's mainly threatening himself, right?
Right.
Any damage suffered, any incidental damage suffered by Chinese or Canadian or Mexican exporters will be dwarfed by the damage suffered by US consumers. Tariffs are always more harmful to the country that applies them. And yet, we know how human psychology is. People respond to this American act of self-harm by self-harming themselves.
Yeah.
Because the politics crowds out the economics, the desire for retaliation overcomes any assessment of your own self-interest. And so you could end up with reciprocal tariffs being triggered, as happened in 2018 when he did this last time. There are still tariffs in place against US goods in Canada, in Mexico, in Russia, in the EU, in India, So that is the bad thing. That is the obvious and, I think, undersold and underexplored threat.
But
to the
would you say that a limited use of tariffs as leverage, as, say, maybe it's a strong word, punishment for nations like China, who positions itself as an adversary of the US? Would you say that in that regard, if Trump really holds to that, obtaining some kind of leverage and then backing down, would you say that could be potentially a useful tool if employed judiciously? That is,
in a war situation, you do that. Okay. I mean, one way of putting this to people watching is as follows: why do we blockade the enemy in war? What are we seeking to achieve when we blockade a hostile belligerent? Right? We're trying to cut off their trade. We're trying to make them poorer. It doesn't matter if it hurts us. We're really trying to hurt them. Right? Can we all agree that we're not doing it to bolster their domestic industry? Right? We're not doing it to nurture infant industries in their country. We're not trying to make them more competitive in the world. Right? A tariff does to yourself in peacetime what the enemy tries to do to you in wartime. It makes it harder for you to buy stuff. Right? It is a self-blockade.
Right.
So for that reason, I think it is a very imperfect tool of diplomacy or foreign policy, because the main damage is to you. Now, just for the avoidance of doubt, Andrei, I am more hawkish about China than most people, including most US commentators. And the real threat I see from China is that it offers an alternative civilizational model. It's not just a country that doesn't like us in the way that Syria or somewhere is a country that doesn't like us. It's a country that has built a panopticon state with state-of-the-art facial recognition and geolocation technology that has pressed its private companies, Alibaba, Tencent, Weibo, and so on, into being spies and proselytizers for the regime. And it has a model that it could export, right? If it can do that in China, it could sell it to Venezuela, Cuba, whoever. So I really do see China as a huge...
I think it has sold it to some extent to the European Union as well. I mean, and to Canada or to Australia, we see it being voluntarily imported by some of these nations.
Right, but we need to get the prescription. We need to get the diagnosis right to get the prescription right. We need to understand exactly what it is that we don't like about what the Chinese are doing. Okay, so these things that China is doing, including things that it's doing to us, like maybe it's putting bugs in some of the things it sells to us, or it's engaging in intellectual property theft, or it's violating copyright. All of that is happening now without any trade deals, right? This is nothing to do with tariffs. This is about invigilating the existing rules. The tariffs will not stop that behavior. They will simply hurt the country that imposes them. And I realize that this is what I'm saying is unpopular. It's always unpopular because tariffs are intuitive. People naturally start by assuming that the tariff is a tax on the other country rather than a tax on yourself. In every age, in every nation, protectionism is popular, but it always makes you poorer. So that is the big danger, that we get caught, the whole world gets caught up in this trade war, right? A trade war between the world's biggest economy and the world's second biggest economy, that's that's going to hurt everybody else.
Right.
We, the UK, are the biggest investor in the US. We get hit by that, even if all of our products are unaffected as a country ourselves. So that is the big danger of Trump. But you originally phrased the question: is there anything we can leverage?
Yes, I mean, it's would it be fair to say, that now with Trump about to take his position as president of the United States, would he be a trump card for liberty-minded people and for those who would like to preserve their, national prosperity, national characteristics, and culture and prosperity in general?
Right. So let's leave aside the bad international economics, because I accept that I suspect that a lot of Elon Musk types, entrepreneurs, voted for him because they thought that domestic tax cuts and deregulation would more than compensate for international protectionism. And they may be right about that. But for the rest of us, what does it mean if we set aside the ill effects of the protectionism? I think the way you raise the question in terms of the kind of culture wars is the really interesting thing. Other English-speaking societies are massively prone to follow American language, iconography, and currents when it comes to culture wars, and especially on issues like race and identity. So, and I think, by the way, not having English as your first language is a remarkably good protector. Right. There is a lot less wokery in France, Spain, Germany than there is in Australia, Canada, the UK.
Right.
Fundamentally because of the amount of US TV dramas that have found their way into our national psychology. So I noticed it started, 25 years ago with the West Wing. British people were unconsciously using American vocabulary whenever they talked about politics, and they would use phrases like separation of powers, which is meaningless in a parliamentary democracy like ours. Or they would say things like all white juries. I mean, in Wales or somewhere, what the hell else are they going to be, right? I mean, they kind of thought that, and this has increased and increased, and it reached its demented peak during the riots in the summer of 2020 that followed the death of George Floyd, which half the British population seemed to convince themselves was somehow the fault of the British police. And for me, the culminating image was a group of largely white British BLM protesters protesting in London and shouting at the police, "Hands up, don't shoot," when of course the Metropolitan Police, as everyone knows, don't carry arms.
Yeah.
And, this has been happening. If you're a white conservative, they call you a Klansman. If you're a black conservative, they call you an Uncle Tom. Apart from being unbelievably rude, what has any of this got to do with us? That wasn't our story. We didn't have the slavery and the segregation, and yet people think we did. And so is there a glimmer of hope, despite all the authoritarianism and protectionism and nativism from Trump? Well, maybe just as we imported all of these terrible ideas from US liberal arts colleges and that then spilled off campus and that then took over the English-speaking world from about 2015 onwards, maybe if there's a backlash against that in the US and that becomes fashionable, we will be part of the backlash.
Right. It's interesting to mention culture, because even here in Romania, as you probably know, after the fall of Ceausescu, what happened is that we imported a lot of American culture, and some of that actually brought some very good ideas with it. But the bad ideas came later as well. So indeed, and we do have quite a lot of people speaking English in Romania, especially in cities and in towns. We had a lot of young people going off to study in Europe or Britain or the United States. So it's clear that maybe the French or the Spanish, who maybe are more reluctant to importing English culture, they would be more shielded. But even there, like you said, you start to see a lot of, like you said, I like the term wokery.
So. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, look, they are bigger languages, right?
Yeah.
Spain has about the same population as Romania, but it has a much bigger language. You can watch a lot more TV in your own language from a lot of different places.
Right. I think it's about
So that
double.
makes-
Our population has gone down quite a lot during the last 20 years or so. But yeah, I mean, it completely makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was in Spain not long ago, and I went to the tomb of Christopher Columbus in Seville. I think it was his tomb. His body was moved so many times after he died, it's hard to say for sure where his remains are. But there's a kind of catafalque carried by kind of caricatured Native Americans and blacks and so on. I mean, that would have come down years ago in a British cathedral.
Right.
The Spanish have still enough perspective to see the big picture, which is, although Christopher Columbus was far from being a perfect human being, he was a deeply flawed man. He lied about what he was doing. He tolerated and engaged in slavery. He was a very bad governor. But that's not why we remember him. We remember him because he brought into contact these civilizations that had previously lived in ignorance of each other, and that led to an extraordinary technological and intellectual flourishing the world over. So keep the Spanish have kept this sense of proportion, which I think on issues of that kind, decolonized type issues, the English-speaking world has completely lost. And yes, Trump is part of the backlash against that, and I hope that we will look back and see this as a moral panic, as a spasm through which we've passed.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely his election did throw a lot of people into a frenzy, whether it was a happy frenzy or a very sad frenzy. Obviously, people tend to overreact, especially in this day and age where everyone is extremely tribalized and passions are running high. So hopefully that will die down a little bit as Trump starts to make his way, hopefully a good way in his new administration. So let's look at these four players. So we have the US with Donald Trump. We have the UK with an already deeply disliked Labour government. We have the hardcore of the EU, whatever that means, if there is such a hardcore. And then we have the Eastern Bloc, which is Romania, Poland, Hungary, and all the other countries that are increasingly bothered by the EU's encroachment and socialist policies. So, how would you see these four parties, four actors interacting in the following 4 years?
I think the UK is the outlier because we have just elected a left-wing government in a way that Europe is not doing. Socialism is almost finished in most of Europe. I mean, it clings on in Sweden and Portugal, but it's in most countries, the old big parties of the centre-left, the French Socialists, the Dutch Labour Party, the Italian PSD, they're all finished. And for understandable reasons, right? I don't expect my children to have a job in the sense that we understood that word in the 20th century. I think that world has gone. I expect that my children will go through life constantly freelancing, reskilling, studying in and out, and portfolio careers doing this and that as technology accelerates. To them, the idea of a political party tied to trade unions and representing mass industrialized labor literally belongs to another century, but belongs actually to another planet, right? So you can see why it's happened. And Britain, for weird coincidental reasons, has gone the other way because we had a very unpopular government that had been in office for a long time when the bills came in for the lockdown and so on.
Right.
But I think the trend generally is away from the old style of dirigist socialism. I think the left is mutating into different forms, sort of eco-extremism and so on.
It's just now taking new strains of the left. So you just mutate it into the next strain.
Exactly. But I would also say that I've always felt that the centralization of the EU, the political union of the EU, is deeply un-European and against the traditions and patrimony of our continent. Imagine that you'd been circling the world in a flying saucer 500 years ago, looking out through your porthole at the great civilizations below, right? Your eye would have been drawn, I put it to you, to the great civilizations of Asia. You'd have seen Ming China with its printing presses, its paper money, its advanced mathematics and cartography, its ocean-going ships. You'd have seen the Mughal Empire in India, again, with extraordinary advances in astronomy and so on. The Ottoman Empire. And then maybe your eye would have been drawn to the broken, scattered tribes at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass. All of your money would have been on Asia. You would have expected the Chinese to sail around Africa and discover Portugal, not the other way around. Okay, so why didn't that happen? Well, this isn't an original thesis of mine. It was due to the Australian historian Eric Jones, brought to a wider audience by Paul Kennedy in his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. The secret of Europe was precisely that it didn't become an empire. It didn't become centralized. It didn't become uniform. It was always a diverse plurality of competing states, each one able to pilot new ideas, trial new schemes, copy what worked best in its neighbors. And this sense of competition among them drove innovation and drove adventurism and made people want to go out and discover new lands and cross the oceans. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this argument, Andrei, right? You don't find many mandarins in China now. You find lots in Brussels, right? The EU is going down this Ming, Mughal, Ottoman path to uniformity, high taxes, centralization. And that, I think, is what is leading to a backlash, which I would say is a very European backlash in favor of the variety, the diversity, the pluralism that was always the secret of the success of European civilization.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because even here in Romania, as let's say the Eurosceptic wave is growing in Romania, because of obvious reasons, nobody actually wants to, leave, a free trade area. But the European Union has gone way past that. We already know that, and there is a narrative here that, and it's not. I think it's not only specific to Romania, that if you have something to say against the European Union, you're against Europe. So there is a narrative that tends to conflate these terms. And I've been trying to explain this to some friends. Look, I love Europe. I love it especially because of its variety, as you said. And that variety does not exclude having free trade. But like I said, it seems to me that we've been, to us, to a lot of Romanian people right now, it seems to us like that. When we had the referendum to join the EU, we didn't actually read the fine print well enough. And now we find out, we have to do this. It's like we don't remember having to do this. So that's very confusing to a lot of people.
Yes, I mean, look, if the EU were still just a free trade area, if it was still the European Economic Community, there would have been no Brexit, there would have been no referendum, there would have been no argument. You'd have to be mad to be against that. How could anyone be against neighboring countries cooperating? I mean, that's easy, right? Everyone can agree to that. The problem is that the EU went a lot further than that. It plainly wanted to become a single country with its own flag and national anthem and passport and parliament and president and external borders, embassies in third countries, criminal justice system, military capacity, you name it. And as the sign in the Berlaymont building in Brussels put it, Europe, your country. And that was always the problem. I just feel that the idea that you need to have a political union to have a free trade area is bizarre and is unique to Europe and isn't recognized anywhere else in the world. I mean, when ASEAN or NAFTA got going, it would have seemed impossible to them to say we can only do this if we have a single currency and etc. And by the way, even the notion of a regional trade bloc is much less powerful than it was in the 50s when the EU was put together. I mean, in the 50s, almost all international trade was local because we didn't have containerization, we didn't have refrigeration, let alone cheap air travel or the internet. So trade was necessarily limited to short distances. That is not the world we live in now. And the idea, yes, it's certainly the case that the EU has a single market. It has an internal free trade area, and that's an achievement. But it has built that to some degree at the expense of trade with the rest of the world by being a customs union with external tariffs that has artificially redirected commerce internally. And, if you're maybe from Slovakia or somewhere, all of your trade is with Europe anyway, so it doesn't really much matter.
Right.
But if you're Britain and most of your trade is with the rest of the world, that was a big cost. So I wouldn't say that the arguments for Brexit are the same for every other country. Maybe if I were a Slovakian or a Luxembourger or whatever, I would see it differently. But from a British point of view, it just didn't make sense for our trade to be focused on an area that wasn't really growing very fast when the bigger opportunities were in English-speaking countries over the oceans.
Right. It's nice because now we're going to the next two questions, which I'm probably trying to maybe put into one single question. So on one hand, in some circles, it is held that although, the UK and the United States are kindred nations, then the United States is still the dominant partner in this. And the second question is that I remember that a while ago, I think in 2018, if you're not mistaken, you were one of the editors of a proposal for a free trade agreement between the UK and the United States. It was, I think, the initiative was led by the Initiative for Free Trade and Cato Institute. And so the first part is of the question: is this real? Is this really the relationship between the US, where the US is the dominant partner? And the second part of the question: what became of that proposal for the trade agreement, and what do you expect to come of it in a Trump administration? Would you see that going through in a more full way as opposed?
Well, let me answer them in reverse order. We did exactly as you say. I brought together, I convened all of the big free market think tanks on both sides of the Atlantic. We had shadow trade talks where we would all sit around an oval table, sometimes in London, sometimes in Washington, and we would go through in quite granular detail what would a perfect, if Milton Friedman on a really good day was designing a free trade agreement, if he could be persuaded to do that.
If I remember correctly, your aim was to deliver to both the UK and US governments a ready-made plan. Just execute the plan. We've done all the homework for you. You just have to put it in place.
Exactly. You put it very well, and you remember it very well. So we had, Cato, Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, Manhattan, Mercatus, Competitive Enterprise. They were all involved. The first time I think they've ever all been involved in the same thing on any project. And we came up with what we think is the perfect trade deal. And we basically said to the two governments, look, we understand that politics is politics. We understand you're not going to do 100% of this. Of course, we get that. But imagine if you could do 60% of this. How cool would that be? And now there was then some progress. I've just my colleague and our friend Syed has just come inside. Come and say hello to Andrei from Romania. We
Salute.
Hello there.
We share an office here.
Sorry, around this way. Salute.
Hey, hello.
So we put all these ideas together, and Theresa May took a long time to even begin the talks. She was so nervous about doing anything while we were still technically in the EU. Boris Johnson was much more positive, but there was little more than a year between Boris taking over and Biden taking over, and so that year to 18 months was not enough to complete things. Now Trump is putting it back on the table. And the really interesting question is whether the British Labour government will have the will and the capacity to take the offer. In economic terms, it's absolutely obvious. We already have a zero tariff comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. Why don't we get one with the US as well? But in political terms, for Labour to do a deal with Trump, which is how it would be portrayed, not with the US, with Trump, is difficult, especially because when Boris was negotiating the same terms in 2019, 2020, Labour, which wanted to rejoin the European Union at that stage, invented all sorts of ridiculous, bogus arguments against it. That Trump wanted to buy the National Health Service, that he was going to make us eat chlorinated chicken, which is what they mean by, the Americans wash their chicken carcasses.
Right.
There's more chlorine in a bag of
Yeah.
washed salad in Europe, right? So all of this. So whether they're going to be able to do that is fascinating, but obviously we should keep pushing. And there will be some elements in the Labour Party who say, look, we can't afford to posture like a student union here. This is a massive economic opportunity. The US is our single biggest trading partner. It's
Right.
by far our single. I mean, bigger than our second, third, and fourth and fifth put together, right? So, to step aside from that and suffer in solidarity with the EU, which is not an organization that has shown us much sympathy over the last 5 years, would be a weird thing to do. So fingers crossed, we'll see. But on the first part, I used to hear this a lot. When I was a member of the European Parliament, people were always making that point, although rarely as politely as you just did. It was more usually phrased as, do you not have any self-respect? You're just a US aircraft carrier. Don't you even have a foreign policy anymore? And I would answer as patiently as I could that because we have similar institutions and a shared political history, because we have the same political culture, going back through the Glorious Revolution to Magna Carta, the same elevation of the individual above the collective, the same common law system, those institutions teach us to respond to the same challenge in similar ways. We found ourselves 3 times in the 20th century in wars against authoritarianism one way or another. The First and Second World War and the Cold War. Not because we felt some kinship based on blood and language. I mean, I'm sure that was a little bit of it, but that really wasn't it. It was that we responded in the same way to authoritarianism. And I think all the English-speaking democracies have that in common, as some European countries do. So, yes, of course, the US is the larger country. They have 5 times our population, and they have made better decisions than we have recently, so they've maximized their wealth more successfully than we have. They don't have the expensive energy that we've imposed on ourselves and all the rest of it. But the reason ultimately that we have tended to be on their side, not just in those big wars, but in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Korea, is because we fundamentally saw the problem in the same way.
Right.
And that, I think, is why under every successive government here, even the left-wing governments, the US is still seen as our chief security partner.
I want just to follow up on the trade question, because this is a curiosity I have and something that I want to make sure that I understood correctly. Is it right that there are some also separate agreements between the UK and separate states of the United States, where there will be, maybe they have different conditions or different advantages, or did I get that correctly? Or
You did. I'm very impressed that you know about this, Andrei. Very few people are so on top of it. Yes, when we were designing the ideal US-UK free trade agreement in 2018, we came across a problem that is peculiar to the United States, that I don't think any other country in the world has, which is the impact of federalism on trade policy. A lot of the advantages in a free trade agreement now are to do with services, and particularly to do with the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. In other words, if somebody is allowed to sell insurance or work in banking or whatever it is in the UK, should they be allowed to do it in the US without needing to requalify, and vice versa? And the problem we ran into, or the challenge we ran into, is that question of occupational licensing is very clearly a state prerogative in the US.
right.
So if you had the most ambitious free trade agreement imaginable between Washington and London, it still couldn't cover most of those things. The only way to make that happen would be to have separate free trade agreements with New York, California, Illinois, and so on. And we've been doing that, including with some very large states. We signed one quite recently. One of the last things the outgoing government did with Florida. If Florida were a European country, it would be the size of Spain, right? These are large economies. So quite apart from whatever we managed to succeed in procuring as a bilateral FTA, we're still going to need these state agreements.
So it's interesting, and I mean, to me, all these details are fascinating because it gives us information, even for us Romanians, onto how trade works, how we can optimize trade. Because a lot of these things, for a lot of people, federalism and how you can deal with different states and all that kind of stuff, it's very new. It's nobody ever thought of it. And that's why for us in Romania, and I'll come back to this. We're learning, and we've been learning a lot by studying the Anglosphere. So, and you just reminded me of this book, which is very nice book. I don't, which is about the UK and American relations during the American Civil War, and among other things, that the book recounts how the difference, the South and the North were trying to obtain Britain's graces somehow, and to make sure that Britain recognizes them, and all the different attempts that were done by the North and the West to appease the UK and to establish a good relationship in order to avoid blockades, or maybe receive some help in blockading the other party. So the whole diplomatic effort was really fantastic. And there was this very nice detail where a southerner representative arrives in London, and a lot of Londoners from the high class Londoners were a bit put off by his his habit of spitting tobacco on the floor or something like that. So and he was there on diplomatic mission, and the whole thing about revolving around cotton. And I remember there was another situation where the South tried to pressure England into favoring it by threatening, a pause in the delivery of cotton or stuff like that. And then Britain said, "Well, we can go get our cotton somewhere else if you guys are going to push this matter too far." So anyway, this is a very interesting book, and I do recommend it to our followers as well. So do get it.
Yeah.
It's a great book, and it's really nicely told.
I mean, it's very interesting. I think there was even a discussion in the Confederate cabinet, in Jefferson Davis's cabinet, about whether they should recognize Queen Victoria as their head of state in exchange for recognition when the war was going very quickly on. It's interesting. There's another book which I'd recommend along similar lines, but with a broader scope to people watching, by a man called Kevin Phillips, and it's called The Cousins' Wars. And his thesis is that the English Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, and the American Civil War were three engagements in one long continuing conflict between, on the one hand, the forces of aristocracy, agriculture, tradition, land, and on the other, the forces of industry, Protestantism, liberty, progress. Now, I think actually on I think the American Civil War, he's pushing it a little bit, but on the first part, it's an incredibly persuasive thesis. The biggest predictor of which side you would fight on as an American colonist in the 1770s was not where you went to church or where you lived or how much you earned. It was which side your ancestors had been on in the English Civil War in the 1640s. And the Patriot and Loyalist sides saw the conflict very consciously in those terms as a continuation. And England divided in its sympathies completely, as Scotland and Ireland did, completely on the basis of which side they had been on in the English Civil War. So the strongest sympathy for the American patriots came from English Protestants, particularly in the south and east of England. In fact, in England generally, there was probably as much sympathy for the American Revolution in England as there was in the colonies, which was kind of 60-40, right? The only way that the monarchists could find soldiers was to recruit them in Scotland and Ireland, because there was almost no one in England who really disagreed with what the Patriot cause was doing. In fact, the American Revolutionary War was a surprisingly I don't want to say gentle, but it was a surprisingly low casualty affair, right? 7 and plus years of fighting, fewer than 7,000 fatalities, right? I mean, that's how many killed in 1 week in Ukraine now, right? So, usually you would just be put under house arrest, or not even that, actually. Often they would just say, look here, Andrei, will you promise not to fight against us again? It's called giving your parole. Then you'd be allowed to go free, right? So it was a very gentlemanly conflict, except the one lot of people in North America who absolutely fought seriously were the Scottish Highland Scots in the Carolinas and in the Hudson Valley, who were loyalists and were absolutely determined that they were not going to live in a Protestant republic. And in fact, a lot of the loyalist regiments that they formed are now in the Canadian Army. They left the country when they lost.
Went north, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's a very... In fact, Jefferson had to be made to take a specific attack on Scotland out of the Declaration of Independence. That was how strongly people felt about it at the time, right? So, I mean, yes, it was, the toughest thing in history is to put yourself properly in the minds of the people at the time who have no knowledge of what is going to follow. No one at the beginning of the American War, no one saw it as a war of independence or as a war between polities. It was universally seen as a civil war within a common polity, which divided Great Britain as well as the colonies. And so when you now go to Lexington and Concord and the tour guides say, well, the British were over here, I mean, no one would have thought in those terms at the time.
Right. Well, this is a very interesting discussion, and hopefully we'll be getting together next time to talk about this, because this is a huge topic in and of itself, and extremely interesting. But I wanted to get back a little bit to our days, and especially talk about, we know that Donald Trump will exit the Paris agreements, and he will put the U.S. back on a path to using fossil fuel, exploring. Using fossil fuels and maybe selling it to other countries as well. Meanwhile, 2 years ago, the UK government sponsored a study. I don't know if you're familiar with it. If not, you should take a look at it. The UK fires, very aptly named, actually. It's in caps. It's supposed to be an abbreviation, I think. But UK fires, again, it's a very apt name for the study, which suggested by 2050, the UK should only have 2 airports, and that the entire world should give up all shipping, all shipping. And the EU, instead of backpedaling a little bit on the whole new Green Deal agenda, what they're doing is just putting their foot forward and saying, we're going to accelerate this to be competitive with the US. So, how do you think this will pan out for both the UK and the EU in relation to the US?
Yeah, I mean, it's we already have the most expensive energy in the industrialized world, and never mind that makes it impossible to be competitive with steel or cement. It makes it impossible to be competitive with AI. I mean, what do they think? Where do they think growth is going to come from? We have contracted out our climate change policy to cultists who have lost any interest in empirical data or in the realm of what is possible. And I say this as someone who absolutely accepts the science of global heating. I think there is little doubt that the world is heating in part as a result of human activity, although nothing like to the extent to which some of the extremists claim. But in order to tackle that, you need to be proportionate and realistic. And the only way ultimately that we're going to tackle this problem is we can't do it through emission reductions. We're going to have to do it through carbon capture. And developing carbon capture technologies means we need to be rich in blunt terms. So making ourselves poorer is incredibly bad for the environment. But you realize the more you look at this policy, the more you realize that it isn't about the environment at all. If you accept the need to phase out fossil fuels over time, and I think there's a perfectly good argument, there's a perfectly good free market argument that says the day will come naturally when the price of renewables falls and the price of extraction of the remaining hydrocarbons rises, and so it will naturally happen that there is this transition, and if governments can just advance that so as to address the externalities of the climate change. I buy that. But if you're trying to phase out fossil fuels, wouldn't it make sense to start by phasing out the fossil fuels that come from dictatorships and dodgy autocracies where there is a higher environmental cost in their extraction, rather than to start with yourself, right? Which is the insanity of what we're doing. And this is why I say it's like a religious movement. It's not about climate anymore. It's about suffering and sacrifice in a quasi-religious way to appease the deities. And that has to end. And I, by the way, I think most centre-right parties are in the right place on this. Most centre-right parties in the world will say, yes, we think that environmental problems are a thing. We think that they need to be tackled. And we will do it as you would expect us to, in a hard-headed, business-like way. We will do it not in a spirit of Greta Thunberg millenarianism, but in a spirit of realism. And that should be a very winning electoral pitch.
Yeah, and I think just to add on this a little bit, I think that the market has actually provided solutions, because if we look at the internal combustion engine, it has evolved tremendously over 100 years. It's more efficient, less polluting, and all of that. So it's the free market. I think
Yes.
it does provide solutions.
By the way, a company that I do some work for here, JCB, they make diggers, they make construction and agricultural
Right.
machinery. They couldn't really. We can't run big diggers on batteries. It doesn't work. You need to dig a hole where there's nowhere to plug them in, and So we invented an internal combustion engine that runs on hydrogen. And this just happened during the second lockdown. They said, let's do this. I mean, the resources may be limited, but human ingenuity is not, and the capacity to solve these problems is infinite, provided that we don't deprive people of resources and incentives to do it.
Right. I was telling you earlier that we here in Romania, and I'm pretty sure that this happened in most of Eastern Europe countries, we did, and we still do, look up to the Anglosphere, and we remembered a lot of things about conservative and classical liberal values by re-importing them, because we did used to have those before the communists came, and we lost a few of them down during the communist regimes. But then we're looking at the Anglosphere, and especially at what the UK and the US exported in terms of culture. We learned a lot, and we were, at least part of us, we were shocked that during the pandemic years, the liberty collapsed the most, and in the most spectacular way, especially in some of the Anglosphere countries, especially Canada and Australia come to mind. UK fared a little better, but not way better. Then you have the United States, where some states were more prudent in being, going all the way into tyranny. But again, to us, it was shocking, because we were expecting to see a resistance to that trend, especially in the Anglosphere, and it was there where it collapsed most spectacularly. So I wanted to ask if you have an explanation for that.
I wish I did. I mean, I can't tell you how much that bothered me. I remember at the beginning of 2020 reading reports of whole cities in China being quarantined, and saying to myself, thank God I live in a country where such a thing is unimaginable.
Right.
Why did I get that wrong? And the lack of interest, either in principle or in practice, in freedom, it wasn't so bad in the US, actually. Other than the closure of the schools, even in the toughest US states, in New York and California, you could still have people in your house.
Yeah.
But in Britain, Canada, Australia, well, New Zealand could quarantine. They were in a slightly different situation.
Yeah.
It was a real shock. And I remember an Australian friend saying, any idea we had of ourselves as a free-spirited, larrikin people, wandering across the outback, discovering things, prospecting for gold, has gone. I was reminded of a remark that the Anglo-Australian writer Clive James made when he said, everyone says we're descended from the convicts, but actually we're more likely to be descended from the prison guards. It was, the truth is that most people in the countries we've just been talking about would have happily had a microchip injected into their arm if it meant that the pubs were open again. And I think it was because the pandemic itself flicked switches in our brains. It made us more authoritarian. These external threats often do that. They bring out the worst tendencies in people. We become bossier, we become more protectionist, we become more intolerant of eccentricity. I remember a neighbor of mine in my village saying, outsiders are using our village shop. And I said to her, well, yeah, where do you think the stuff in the shop comes from? But this is how people start thinking at those times. And I'm afraid it's going to take us years to get over it, because the needle has just moved on what people now expect governments to do.
Yeah, it's exactly, because what happens is that before 2020, the worst threats that we could imagine in the various countries were communist North Korea, Venezuela, Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders. But then in 2020, all this flip came around, and it looked to me that we were living under the impression that we were living in a world that was on a path to freedom and prosperity, and we were actually not, because the changes that came in 2020, they didn't just come overnight. It's clearly that thing, not the pandemic itself, but the mentality, the government mentality that they can do whatever they did there was something that did not happen overnight. And when it happened, we were still surprised. We were blindsided. Nobody expected it. I remember saying that even where in Romania, when they actually proposed to restrict, I said, well, this is not good. It was, and it was something instinctual. Maybe it was also because I read some of the founding fathers and so I had some inkling that maybe there was an argument against that. But there was also something deeply instinctual that told me this is wrong. This is not going to end well, and this is going to last way over those 2 weeks that they were initially saying that.
Yeah.
So again, were we oblivious to subtle change that came into the mentality of governments over the years, or in the ideology of governments, and then it suddenly just was springed on?
I don't think so. I mean, I agree with you 100% about the flip. A visitor from another planet in the summer of 2020, just observing the kind of daily texture of life, would have assumed that Russia was a much more free society than Britain or Australia, right? Restaurants were open, you could travel where you wanted. You would have assumed that was the more liberal place, which is not because Russia is a liberal place.
Yeah.
Right? It was a comment on what we were doing.
It's not something. It's not lauding Russia. It's about criticizing whatever we became in that period of time.
It was insane, but I don't think that was driven by governments. I think it was driven by panicky public opinion, for very understandable, in a way, psychological tribal promptings. A pathogen makes people panic, and it wasn't that we were putting up with restrictions, we were demanding them. I mean, you weren't, I wasn't, but we were brutally reminded of what a tiny minority we liberty-minded people are, even in normal times, let alone in a situation like that. So again, I was made brutally aware of how artificial an open society based on personal autonomy is, how much it runs up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our DNA. And I went into 2020 as a Johan Norberg, Steve Pinker, Matt Ridley, rational optimist. I've never quite been able to recapture that feeling since the lockdown knocked it out of me. If people are capable of turning that suddenly in a panic on science, on asking questions, on any notion of freedom,
and on each other, that was the biggest shock for me, especially here where we had that experience during the communist regime. we did that. We and I've seen people turning on each other. Friendships, and myself. I had two friends just ending relationships, 20-year-long relationships with me based on my positions on maybe we shouldn't lock everyone inside. So
Well, I think I was the first author in Britain, the first person to write columns saying that, because I could see it coming actually towards the
Right.
end. I wrote a column in late February saying there is going to be a massive overreaction, and every newspaper will overreact, every scientific advisory body will overreact, and every politician will overreact, and here's why they will do it. The same panicky predictions that we had from bird flu, swine flu, Ebola, etc., etc. And it's going to be even worse this time. And I don't think I've ever had such a negative reaction. And I kept saying this all the way through the first lockdown. And, you're killing my grandmother, you selfish swine, how can you do this? And the weirdest argument that I kept getting more from all over was, why are you putting the economy before lives? Which is an extraordinary phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a variant of we should put people before profits. I mean, what do people think the economy is? Do they? And what I realized is that what a lot of people mean by the economy is not the word we give to voluntary transactions that improve our happiness. They imagine it as this kind of separate, disembodied entity that churns out ingots of gold for rich Tories. And has nothing to do with how they live. And this is when you think, God, we've really got to go back to first principles and start explaining how things work. By the way, when you get a properly socialist government as we have now, very quickly people see what those first principles are. They understand it. We have not had unemployment really other than a blip since the early 90s. We haven't had, contraction other than during lockdown. People are going to understand what the economy actually means and why it matters in the most brutal sense.
Right. Do you think, is there any chance that some people will be held accountable for what happened during the pandemic? Because it looks to me like they're not going to be held accountable.
No.
Or it's going to be too late.
They've already written the narrative, which is that we should have locked down even earlier and even harder. And nobody really wants to revisit. I mean, this is the most depressing thing, Andrei. When you try and talk to people, they just don't want to think about it. On one level, they know that we overreacted massively.
Right.
And they can't bring themselves to face the fact that all those indignities and absurdities that we lived through were self-inflicted. So they just don't want to think about it. So the idea to get people to understand that we mustn't do this again, that this mustn't become a normal piece of the arsenal of a government, requires them to go back through that self-analysis, which nobody wants to do. I made a speech in the Lords recently, I'm sure you can get it, where I talked about a story that James Thurber, the American comic novelist, told of his town in Columbus, Ohio, when everyone ran away one day by accident because somehow they got it into their heads that the dam had burst and that the town was going to be flooded. And they ran and ran for miles, the whole town, before they realized that there was no evidence that the dam had burst and that even if it had, it couldn't have reached the town. And his punchline was, everyone kind of sheepishly came back and then nobody mentioned it. Woe betide you if you try to make a joke about the day that everyone went for a run. And I think that's where we are with the lockdowns.
Right. So there is one more thing I wanted to touch on, and then two closing questions. Freedom of speech has been pretty much one of the most important things we've been talking about during the last years, especially since it was either restricted or being shamed during the pandemic. But that trend continued, and we've seen I think a cataclysmic, maybe in a good way, cataclysmic for one of the side of the issue, change in the attitude towards freedom of speech with Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. And we see the European Union being very, very, very angry at Elon Musk and Twitter, And we know that both Europe and UK have traditionally been more restrictive, mainly for historical reasons, with freedom of speech. But we've seen Britain again going towards a very bad path, with policemen checking your thinking and all that kind of stuff, which it has gone around the world. And it left some of us, at least me and some of my friends, it left us perplexed. How could that happen in Britain? I mean, we know.
Yeah, imagine how it seemed to us. I mean,
I mean, it's like how is that are Brits
extraordinary.
in general being apprehensive about this? Are they being worried about this situation?
So Britain was always much more Atlantic than European in this regard. During the Cold War, free speech was upheld here in the same way that it was in the US, without a First Amendment, because it was just a cultural norm.
Mm-hmm.
And people used to use the phrase "it's a free country" all the time. Am I allowed to say that? It's a free country.
Yeah.
And it wasn't completely ironic. It went without saying.
Yeah.
You never really hear it now. And there's a reason you don't hear it now. The retreat from free speech and free association and the other liberties, I think, weirdly coincided with victory in the Cold War. There was nobody to define ourselves against directly. And it also coincided with this new religion of woke, of deferring to the imagined sensitivities of protected minorities. So almost every free speech violation that you look at, almost everything that you hear of, is a case of somebody supposedly having said the wrong thing in a way that might offend somebody in a protected category. And this, I honestly think, has taken over from the place that religion used to have for people. It's given them a sense of purpose and meaning. My daughter she recently graduated from Oxford, so I can now tell you the story without getting her into trouble. But when she was there, she was told that as a condition of being at her college, she and all the others had to do a kind of white privilege test, where it was like a questionnaire,
right?
And the correct answer for each question is, it's all the fault of white people. Now, 200 years ago, to matriculate at Oxford, you had to swear an oath abjuring Catholicism, right? So the condition of being there, you wanted to study maths, French, whatever it was, you had to say, "I solemnly swear that the bread and wine used in the communion are not really the body and blood of Jesus, but only a symbol," right? You literally had to do that. Now, what has that got to do with studying maths or French?
Right.
Exactly as much or as little as the white privilege test. And yet you try and explain that to a lot of students now, and they go, "How can you possibly say that? How can you compare that nasty, bigoted piece of anti-Catholic legislation with being nice to minorities?" Because they're so in the matrix that they can't see it. And that leads me to the terrifying thought that we had for those 200 years between the abolition of the Test Act and this modern one. We had what looked like a golden age of free speech, what looked like a liberal paradigm where freedom of contract, freedom of association, freedom of worship, freedom of expression were all respected. But actually, I wonder whether it wasn't just a standoff between the old authoritarianism of religion and the new one of identity politics. Neither side commanded the heights. And so almost by accident, during the transition, there was room for liberty to flourish between the death of the old Christian morality and the rise of the new trinity of diversity, equity, inclusion. And if that's the case, then I'm afraid, where if you like, we're going back. When people say post-COVID is a new normal, it's actually a very old normal.
Yeah,
where truth is seen as handed down by the
just
authorities.
The God has changed.
Right. And that is a pretty depressing thought.
Yeah, indeed. And you remind me of a piece James Lindsay, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, did about Marxism. And he actually said, look, Marx was not an economist, he was a theologian. He just came up with this new theology, on the heels of the French Revolution, where we take this god away and then we just put another instead. And so, yeah, it makes sense that you will see this translated even to, to all this eco madness where we see the same mechanisms in place.
And like with all prophets, his prophecies spectacularly failed to come true, right? I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Marx is that he presented his thesis not as a political opinion, but as scientific truth. This must happen, and it will happen in the following way. And of course, none of it came true. I mean, he was about as bad a forecaster as you could get. The wealth was not concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller elite. There wasn't a big immiseration of the proletariat. On the contrary, capitalism enlarged the middle class everywhere where it was practiced. Far from making people poorer, it led to the most spectacular takeoff of living standards. The revolution didn't happen in Germany and England in the way that it was supposed to. He got everything wrong. And yet, like every dead prophet, like every bearded patriarch of a prophet, those who come after do the classic religious millenarian thing of saying, in our lifetime, the prophecy really is going to come true. The second coming is happening for real now.
Right.
And however many times they've been disproved, well, that just strengthens their faith. And you're absolutely right. So I wonder whether we've actually just come to the end of a very lucky period where there was just a gap between the two ideologies.
Right. So would you have any words of wisdom for the hardworking Romanian individual who wants to be left alone and live his life in peace?
I don't know. I don't know about words of wisdom. I'm actually quite optimistic about Romania. I think Romania has a very common sense population who have been immune to a lot of this madness. I think people actually have nobody ever believes me in Romania when I say this, but people have a terrific work ethic and actually a high level of education given the GDP per head. So Romania has everything going for it except the political institutions that encourage investment. And that's the thing to work on. You want to be in a place where you have security of contract, security of tenure, where you're not going to have some dodgy judge or politician making life difficult for you. And so I would say, if you're a patriotic Romanian listening to this broadcast, resist the pressure to emigrate and don't be scared of going into politics. Don't be scared of making changes. Plato says that the price of not being involved in politics is that you're governed by your inferiors. And we can all think of examples of that in my country and in yours, right? So don't be, and don't think it's impossible. We live in an age when the barriers to entry have been lowered spectacularly by technological change and communications revolutions. So if you get the right message and the right people, it's possible to build something better.
If you read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, especially in the Prelude to Foundation, he talks about a decaying empire, and that one of the first signs of the decaying empire is the failure of the train, all the train infrastructure. Even though the trains were futuristic, that was the first to fail. Then you have Ayn Rand, in Atlas Shrugged. It's the same. The railways are the first to fail and the first to be attacked. And today you see, in Germany, you see the Deutsche Bahn having huge issues in the last 2 years. And I think even in Britain, there are some issues as well. Would you say there is a relationship between transport infrastructure and the state of a nation or an empire or
I love the thesis. In both Asimov's time and Ayn Rand's, trains were still modern technology. I think the problem we have in Europe now, certainly that we have in Britain, is since lockdown, lots of people have stopped working or have stopped going to work. They're either working or they've dropped out, right? So we are paying an immense amount of money to people who work on trains to run emptier trains. And I'm not sure that the train itself is the aptest symbol, because it may just be displaced by more advanced ways of getting from A to B more directly.
Right.
But I think the general point about infrastructure, yeah, absolutely. This was, I think this haunts the imagination of everyone in Europe, right? If you grew up in, for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, you were surrounded by the remnants of a past civilization that took the form of degraded infrastructure.
Right.
Old broken roads and aqueducts and walls, right? So, yes, I think a state that can't do the basics because it's paying so much money to its client groups or has run out of tax or has overextended itself as a borrower, the sign will indeed be that it's not, there are potholes in the roads, there are street lights aren't working so well, whatever it is. So in that sense, yes, I think the trains are a good symbol.
Final question. Will Britannia rule again?
Well, you should be careful of the idea of sort of inevitable rises and falls. It was the great 14th century Tunisian Ibn Khaldun, who came up with this idea of rise and fall. It's you'll have seen a million times the version of the meme that says, hard times make strong men, strong men make soft times make weak men. Right? That's all basically from Ibn Khaldun. He was the progenitor of that idea. And yet countries do sometimes come back. I mean, India has plainly come back from, it was a great civilization, then it had a bad moment, then it came back again. You could make certainly the same argument about China. I would even make the argument about the city of London, where I'm talking to you from. It was obviously the global capital in the 19th century. It was displaced by New York and other places in the 20th century, and then it came back in the late 20th century. So I don't think there is an inescapable historical trajectory. I think it's up to countries to pursue the policies that make them more or less prosperous.
Right. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. This was great, and I hope you had as much fun as I had. And,
what a pleasure, Andrei.
And I will definitely love to have you on again. Again,
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you very much indeed.
And let's do this as soon as possible. Thank you.
Let's. Okay. All the best.
All the best.